The first time it happened, I thought it was just a dream. I woke up frozen, every muscle locked, as something moved in the corner of my room. I couldn't scream, couldn't breathe, only watch as the darkness bent and shifted into something human, but not human at all. Its weight pressed against the bed, closer and closer, until I felt its breath on my skin. And just as I thought it would speak, the world snapped back to silence. But that wasn't the end. That was only the beginning. The autumn had settled heavily over the small town, the kind of season that turned the air crisp and carried the smell of damp leaves through every open window. For most, it was comforting. For Claire, it was a reminder of how quiet her world had become. She had moved back into her childhood home after her father passed, a house that stood on the far edge of town, where the streetlights thinned and the woods crept closer with every passing year. By day, it felt almost ordinary. The kitchen still smelled faintly of coffee grounds and pine cleaner. The hallway still bore faint marks where her father had penciled her height year after year. But at night, the silence became unbearable. The kind of silence where the ticking of a clock sounded like footsteps, and the hum of the refrigerator could be mistaken for a whisper. She tried to convince herself it was only nerves. After all, the house had been empty for nearly a decade. Dust clung to the walls, floorboards groaned in protest at every step, and the air felt permanently chilled, as though no amount of heat could settle in the bones of the place. Even when she wrapped herself in blankets, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was only a guest in her own home. The neighbors rarely came by. A few of them had offered her sympathetic nods when she returned, but no one lingered long in conversation. Once, the woman across the street had said quietly, "Strange place to come back to, after everything." But when Claire asked what she meant, the woman just pressed her lips tight and closed the door. At first, Claire tried to ignore it. She unpacked her belongings, repainted the upstairs bedroom, and stacked her father's books neatly on the shelves. Still, certain things resisted her efforts to restore normalcy. The basement, for instance, its doors stuck badly at the hinges, and when she finally forced it open, the air that rushed up was so bitterly cold it made her breath cloud. She shut it quickly and told herself she'd deal with it later. Nights were the hardest. She would lie awake, listening to the house settle, telling herself each creak and pop was natural. But every so often, she'd wake suddenly, heart pounding, as though something had pulled her from sleep. She could never remember the dream. Only the feeling that someone had been watching her in the dark. On the third night, she noticed it, a faint mark on her bedroom window, like the smear of a handprint. She wiped it away with a sleeve, convinced it was just condensation. The next night, the mark was back, this time clearer, as though the hand had pressed harder against the glass. Still, she tried to reason with herself. It was an old house. Windows leaked. Air shifted strangely through broken seals. She told herself these things over and over until she almost believed them. But deep down, she couldn't shake the memory of something her father had once said when she was young, something she had brushed off as one of his strange habits. "Don't leave the curtains open at night," he had told her. "The woods don't like being watched." Claire had laughed then. But now, lying awake in that quiet house, staring at the black line of trees through her window, the words carried a different weight. At first, Claire thought she could adapt. The silence of the house became familiar, the creaks and groans something she could almost predict. She forced herself to follow routines, morning coffee, an evening walk, and reading before bed. It was comforting, in a way, to pretend the house was just that, wood, plaster, paint. Nothing more. But the house disagreed. It began with sound. Not loud, not sudden, just a faint rhythm that didn't belong. At night, when she lay awake, she started to hear it. A soft tap, pause, tap. Like fingertips brushing the walls in the hallway. She got up once, thinking it might be a branch swaying outside, but the windows were clear, the night still. The sound stopped when she turned on the light, then returned once the room sank back into darkness. The next night, it grew bolder. The taps became scratches, thin and deliberate, traveling along the baseboards of her bedroom. She sat up, her pulse hammering, and held her breath. The scratching stopped instantly, as though it had been listening too. By day, the house seemed almost embarrassed, returning to its lifeless stillness. Sunlight cut through the dusty curtains, birds chattered from the woods, and she could almost laugh at herself for being afraid. Almost. The third night brought something new. A smell, faint but undeniable, rotting earth, damp and metallic, as though the basement had been flooded and left to stew. It crept up the stairs, coiling into her room until she pressed her face into her pillow to escape it. She promised herself she would check the basement in the morning. But when the sun rose, the air was clean again, carrying only the faint, musty scent of wood and dust. She delayed checking for days, but the smell kept returning, always at night, always stronger. When she finally worked up the nerve to open the basement door, her hand trembled on the knob. The hinges gave way with a groan, and the air that rushed up was cold. Colder than she remembered. She switched on the light, but the bulb only flickered weakly before dying, leaving the concrete steps swallowed in black. She told herself she'd replace the bulb later, but later never came. Instead, the house found other ways to remind her. One morning, she woke to find her front door standing wide open. She could have sworn she had locked it, she always locked it, but perhaps she had been careless. That explanation soothed her only until the following night, when she double-checked the lock, tested the handle, and even placed a chair against the knob before going to bed. At 3 in the morning, she woke to the sound of the chair scraping against the floor. The door stood open again. The woods stared back at her through the gap, dark and endless. She closed it quickly, heart pounding, and leaned against the frame, afraid to look outside too long. Afraid of what might look back. From then on, sleep came only in fragments. She drifted in and out, waking to odd sensations, the brush of cold air against her face, the feeling of the mattress dipping as though someone had sat at the edge of the bed. Each time she tried to convince herself it was nothing more than imagination stretched thin by grief and exhaustion. But imagination didn't leave bruises. She noticed them one morning, faint, crescent-shaped marks along her arm, as if fingernails had pressed too hard against her skin. They were deep enough to sting when she touched them, yet she had no memory of how they appeared. The mirror became her enemy. She caught glimpses of movement in its edges, shapes that vanished the moment she turned. Once, as she brushed her teeth, she saw a figure behind her in the reflection, tall, indistinct, standing at the bedroom door. When she spun around, the hallway was empty. The toothbrush slipped from her hand and clattered into the sink, foam spilling down her chin as she fought the urge to scream. She began covering the mirrors at night, draping towels and sheets over them like shrouds. It made the rooms feel heavier, suffocating, but at least she didn't have to see the shadows anymore. The neighbors noticed the change. When she passed the woman across the street, the woman's eyes lingered too long on the dark circles beneath Claire's eyes, the tremor in her hands. You should think about staying somewhere else, the woman murmured, almost too quietly to hear. Claire wanted to ask why, wanted to demand an answer, but her throat closed, and the woman turned away before she could speak. By the second week, the house no longer waited for nightfall. She began hearing footsteps in the afternoon, faint but deliberate, moving above her when she knew the rooms upstairs were empty. Doors creaked open and shut while she made coffee in the kitchen. Once, while searching for her phone, she found it lying neatly in the middle of the hallway floor, though she knew she had left it charging by the bed. The woods outside mirrored her unrest. She began noticing shapes between the trees, tall and unmoving, too far to make out yet always facing the house. The handprint returned to her window, clearer now, fingers spread wide as though pressing against the glass from the outside. She wiped it away, but by the next evening, it was back, only this time on the inside. Her nerves unraveled. Sleep became impossible. She prowled the house at night with every light on, whispering her father's words like a prayer, "Don't leave the curtains open. The woods don't like being watched." But even with the curtains drawn, she couldn't escape the feeling that something was inside, something that had been waiting for her to return. The scratching in the walls grew frantic. The smell of rot thickened until she gagged. Cold drafts followed her from room to room, brushing her neck like invisible fingers. And always, just at the edge of sleep, she felt the mattress shift, weight pressing down beside her, close enough to touch, though she never dared look. Then came the whisper. It was faint at first, a broken breath curling into her ear, words she couldn't understand. But each night it grew louder, more insistent, until one phrase cut through the static, low and clear. You shouldn't have come back. Her pulse hammered so violently she thought her chest might split. She scrambled from the bed, slamming every light on, but the whisper followed her into the hall, slipping through the cracks in the walls, rising from the floorboards beneath her feet. And then it stopped. The house fell silent, suffocating in its stillness. She stood trembling in the middle of the hallway, ears straining for the smallest sound, when she noticed something she hadn't before. Every picture on the wall was crooked, tilted in the same direction. That was when she understood, the house wasn't just haunted. It was watching her. Sleep no longer came. Every night stretched into hours of pacing and listening, straining to separate real sound from her own imagination. The scratches in the walls had become constant, no longer rhythmic but desperate, like claws tearing through plaster. The smell of rot seeped into everything, her clothes, her sheets, even her skin, clinging no matter how often she washed. By the third week, Claire felt hollowed out, her nerves stretched until they hummed with pain. She thought about leaving, packing a bag, running to the nearest hotel, abandoning the house forever. But each time she stepped toward the door, her body froze, as though the thought itself wasn't hers to act on. As though the house had already decided she belonged. That night, the house made its claim. It began with the windows. Every curtain she had drawn was ripped open, one after another, as if unseen hands moved from room to room. Claire stumbled after the sound, too terrified to follow, too terrified to stay still. The woods stared through every uncovered pane, the trees pressed tight against the glass like a crowd leaning in. Their shadows stretched impossibly long across the floors, shifting in the dim light until they looked like figures, silent and waiting. She fled upstairs, clutching her phone, but the screen was black. No matter how many times she pressed the buttons, it stayed dead, refusing her even the comfort of a glow. The air grew colder, so sharp it burned her throat. She could see her breath spilling out in frantic bursts as she staggered into the bedroom, slamming the door shut. That was when the whisper returned. Not faint, not broken, clear and close, spoken just behind her ear. You shouldn't have come back. She spun, but the room was empty. The mattress dipped anyway. The sheets shifted as though an invisible body was crawling across them, the weight dragging slowly toward her. She pressed herself against the wall, heart hammering, but the depression in the mattress only deepened until the blankets tugged to the side and fell to the floor. Then she heard it. The sound of something breathing. Not hers, slower, heavier, wet with each inhale. It filled the room until she thought she would suffocate beneath it. She staggered toward the hallway, desperate for light, for air, for anything but this suffocating presence. But when she opened the door, the house no longer looked like her house. The walls pulsed with black stains, veins of mold spreading as she watched. The floor sagged, soft and wet beneath her feet, releasing the smell of damp earth with every step. From the ceiling, a steady drip of brown water tapped against her shoulders and hair. The family photographs that had once lined the walls were gone, replaced by warped frames holding nothing but streaks of gray, as though faces had melted from the glass. The whisper followed her, spilling from every room. Overlapping now, one voice, then another, then dozens, all murmuring at once, rising and falling like the tide. Words she couldn't understand clawed at her ears until her head rang, and somewhere beneath the chaos, the phrase repeated, steady as a heartbeat. You shouldn't have come back. You shouldn't have come back. Claire stumbled toward the stairs, half running, half falling. The steps stretched beneath her, longer and longer, until she thought she would never reach the bottom. When she finally did, the basement door stood wide open, though she had never touched it. Cold air spilled out, sharper than ice, carrying with it a stench so strong she gagged. Something waited below. She knew it, felt it in her marrow, but the whisper left her no choice. The air pressed against her back like hands, shoving her forward, dragging her down the steps one at a time. The light above flickered and died, leaving only the black. She reached the bottom, trembling, and the floor beneath her bare feet was not concrete but soil, wet, uneven, sinking under her weight. The basement stretched wider than it should, impossibly deep, the ceiling lost in shadow. And there, half buried in the earth, were shapes. Dozens of them. Human forms twisted and curled, their skin gray, their mouths frozen open as though caught mid-scream. Her stomach lurched. She stumbled back, but her foot caught on something, a bone, jutting from the ground like a broken branch. She nearly fell, catching herself against the wall, but the wall pulsed, soft beneath her palm, as though she had pressed against flesh. A sound rose in the silence. A chorus of breaths, ragged and wet, fills the cavern. The shapes in the soil twitched, fingers clawing upward, mouths moving as though trying to form words. And above them, in the far corner of the basement, something moved. It crawled from the shadows, its body stretching taller than any man, its limbs too long, bending at angles that made her stomach turn. Its face was wrong, not one face, but many, shifting and sliding beneath its skin, as though the house had gathered every image it had ever consumed. Its eyes, dozens of them, opened at once, gleaming pale in the dark, fixing on her. The whispers stopped. The house fell silent. And then, all at once, every voice spoke through the thing's mouth. "You shouldn't have come back." Claire screamed, but the sound was devoured by the walls, swallowed before it left her lips. The figure surged forward, the earth splitting beneath its weight, and the bodies buried in the soil reached for her, fingers clutching at her ankles, her wrists, her hair. She fought, tearing herself free, stumbling back toward the stairs. But the steps were gone. The basement stretched endlessly behind her, the ceiling shut, trapping her in the soil, in the dark, with the thing that was no longer just a part of the house but the house itself. The ground trembled. The walls leaned closer. The figures in the soil pulled harder, dragging her down inch by inch. Her nails split as she clawed at the dirt, her throat raw from silent screams. The last thing she saw before the earth closed over her face was the shifting thing standing above her, its dozens of eyes blinking in perfect unison, its mouths curling into something that almost resembled a smile. Then came the darkness. A silence so absolute it felt alive. And in that silence, a final whisper brushed against her ear, gentle, almost tender. "Now you belong to us." When the silence broke, it was morning. Sunlight spilled across the bedroom floor, sharp and golden, as though nothing had happened at all. Claire sat upright in her bed, lungs straining, her throat raw, her sheets soaked with sweat. For a fleeting second, she thought she had woken from a nightmare. But the dirt beneath her fingernails told her otherwise. She stumbled from the bed, her legs trembling, and caught her reflection in the mirror before remembering she had covered it. The sheet had fallen away in the night. Her own face stared back at her, pale, hollow, but it wasn't only hers. For a fraction of a second, other faces flickered in the glass. A man with a split lip. A woman with sunken eyes. A child with soil pressed into their hair. They rippled across her skin like water before vanishing, leaving only her terrified gaze. She didn't scream. She couldn't. The house was quiet. The smell of rot had receded. The curtains lay open, though she couldn't remember touching them. And from the woods, the trees stood still, their branches stretched toward her window as though waiting. Claire tried to leave that day. She gathered her keys, her phone, backpack, and made it as far as the front door. But when she turned the knob, it wouldn't budge. She jiggled it, twisted harder, even kicked the wood, but the door remained sealed, as though fused to the frame. She pressed her ear against it and heard something on the other side, breathing. Slow. Patient. Hungry. She backed away, heart hammering, and glanced at the hallway mirror. Her reflection didn't move when she did. It stayed still, watching her with eyes that weren't hers. When she blinked, it smiled. She ran upstairs, locking herself in the bathroom, turning on every faucet to drown out the silence. But the water ran brown, thick with soil, and from the drain rose a whisper. You belong here now. She collapsed against the tiles, sobbing, nails scraping at her arms as if she could peel the house off her skin. But the dirt beneath her nails wouldn't wash away. It had settled into her. Become part of her. That night, she didn't fight sleep. She lay still, staring at the ceiling, listening as the walls breathed with her. The mattress dipped beside her. Fingers brushed her hair. A voice, softer than before, curled into her ear, not threatening, not cruel, but final. We've been waiting so long. Welcome home. If you're still here, then you've walked the halls of this house with me. You've heard the whispers, felt the weight in the dark. And maybe it followed you, too. If you want the voices to stay quiet, share this story. If you want to know what else waits in the shadows, subscribe, and keep your lights on. Because next time, we'll step into a place where no one ever returns whole. And the shadows, well, they're already waiting.